Welcome to our podcast on culture, leadership, and inclusion. I'm Sasha Graham.
And I'm Keon West, and we're here to bring you the very best of the science
and practical solutions on how to enhance your workplace culture and other fun things. Right, Keon, let's
Sasha.
talk about my favorite topic, which is social mobility.
I thought your favorite topic was Star Trek.
Okay, well, we can talk about Star Trek. We can definitely integrate Star Trek in the conversation about social mobility.
Okay, but social mobility it is. Let's do social mobility.
Okay, the reason why I say that social mobility is my favorite topic is because when it comes about, I think when generally in the context of diversity and inclusion, people like to have a hierarchy or like their specific area, that demographic characteristic that drives it all for you.
Yeah.
And mine is social mobility.
Tell us why.
Well, because I think I'm a very socially mobile person.
Ooh. Well,
Yeah.
now this requires a backstory.
Well, the backstory to that, and maybe the overview of it, is that I think I find myself in a different social circle than I originally come from. So my background and story is that, I was born and bred in Soviet Union, and then as the Soviet Union collapsed, basically things have descended into Hunger Games, right? My family went from having some money in the bank to waking up having absolutely nothing. And I mean, my mum at the time worked at the hospital, and all the social services kind of collapsed. There was no currency. Like everything descended into chaos. So the gangs and gang violence appeared very quickly, and racketeering. So it all became quite aggressive and chaotic very quickly. And it just meant that my family, as so many other families, they just found themselves in these set of circumstances where you literally have no money. So the only thing you have, and you're not getting like my mum stopped getting paid. There was she once got paid with, she had like 3 chickens given to her as a payment. Sometimes we would get
Three
flowers.
chickens for how much work exactly?
Well, that was her monthly salary, 3 chickens.
Okay, that's a bad rate. I was trying to figure out, is it 3 chickens an hour? In which case,
I
there's
know.
quite a lot of chickens by the end of the week, but no, 3 chickens a month is terrible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I never thought about it that way. It's like,
Like the
oh,
chicken.
mom, you could have negotiated a better rate.
Yeah.
Give
Four
me
and a half
chicken.
chickens at the least, man.
Yeah, and it's just not something that you think about, right? Working as
Oh,
in a hospital and getting paid in chickens.
yeah.
But that I think created a certain context for my upbringing, which was basically, like survival mode. And, the main focus for my family was like, how are we going to get through the winter? And again, I think we had an allotment and we grew quite a lot of food over the summer. And then, yeah, August, September, mum went into like preservation mode and like we preserved all the food. Well, a lot of that stuff. But all of that means that nowadays, when I find myself in more affluent communities, which is most of the time actually, especially in the context of our clients, I can't
Mm.
answer questions around like skiing. It's like, where did I go skiing as a child? Or did I enjoy living in New York? And
Mm.
various other things that I have no references to. And I know that
Yeah.
whilst my experience is quite, I don't know, maybe a bit niche,
Yeah.
there's still a lot of people in the UK who probably have more of a closer experience with me than with more upper middle class people who regularly go on skiing trips and just had a very specific lifestyle growing up.
Yes. And I think while not everyone, face a very specific collapse of the Soviet Union challenges that you faced, I do think that the experience you're describing is moving from a poorer background or a more working class background or the kind of background where you don't always have food and you're paid in chickens to a background where you're hanging out in boardrooms all the time. And you also have the secondary confusing experience of and I don't like this word. I'll see if I can come up with a better one. But the word people often use is passing for a middle class person in these spaces. So people ask you, "Oh, where did you go on skiing holidays?" Because the assumption is you must be like them, that you've integrated, you now look to them like one of them.
Exactly. And I think this is the challenge, right? Because when you're faced with that question, you have two choices. You can either go along and try to pretend that you are part of that group because you don't want to challenge their belief that you are kind of from the same circle because that you it's an in, right? It gives you that sense of belonging. You're part of the inner circle. Because the
Yeah.
risk is if you take another path and go like, well, you know, I've never done skiing because my mother has been paid in chickens. It
How many chickens per ski lift, sir? That'd be at least half
exactly.
a chicken, madam.
It's um well, first of all, it's a lot to unpack, right, in one
Yeah.
statement. And second, you might lose that connection. You might be part of that out,
Mhm.
you might become out of the
Yeah.
group. And
Yes.
that's where the anxiety comes in.
Yeah. I could see that. And I think it's fair because social mobility is a tricky thing. Well, they're all tricky things. So I do love people with the worldview that, gender is incredibly simple, easy to measure, very straightforward. Like race is a thing. There are five boxes. You can be white, black, East Asian, South Asian, or maybe one other thing. Put in like Middle Eastern or Latino, but that's it. And you get that one other thing. But this is not the world. We've made up most of the social categories that we belong to. We've made up countries as people who come from places like the former Soviet Union or the former Yugoslavia or like Taiwan know all too well countries aren't real. They're stuff that we make up and then we treat each other differently accordingly. But social class is trickier because you can kind of just see gender and see race at least most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. You just look at people and say, oh, well, that's a black person, that's an Indian person, that's a woman, that's a man, and you move on. Social class is harder because A, there's a struggle about exactly what it means. So there's a question of whether you now are genuinely a middle class person, which some people would believe that just because of your change in job, your change in relative level of affluence, change in the things that you do, now you are just a middle class person. Whereas other people would think you can't do that in a lifetime, that if you start out working class, you must remain working class, and that's important. And the other trouble is that people will treat you differently, that they'll treat you worse because of the class you belong to. There's quite a lot of research that mirrors the research on race and gender that, for example, has people say the same thing, but in two different accents. And if you say it in a working class accent, then you're perceived as dumber and less interesting and less welcome. And if they find out that you have a working class background, people are less interested in hanging out with you and they're not as nice to you and they don't expect as much from you. So I can get the risk that if you out yourself as a working class person, people aren't going to be as nice, or some people aren't going to be as nice. And that's something to worry about.
And I really like that you brought accents into it because a few years ago we published research around accents, and that's exactly what we found. And there are many similar type of researchers out there that, but they find that a lot of people, I think up to 60% of people who come into London with regional accents change them because, again, it stops them from getting that recognition and actually being treated with the stigma that is attached to the regional accent. And I think West Country accent has been considered to be the worst, and then it's moving to kind of West Midlands and Northern accents, which
Yeah.
um, which again is very frustrating because a lot of the time that is part of people's identity. And we when we're talking about accents, it is specifically accents, right? Not necessarily, yes, there is like jargon and local vernacular that, for example, not is not understood outside of the locality. But so it's that's not what we're talking about. Yes, there's certain words. It's specifically the accent that people use.
Yes. And I think the accent in much of the research stands in for something else. And I do think it's worth being clear about what classism is about. Like, classism is a belief system in which you say that certain people are in fact better than other people, that they're just cleaner, nicer, shinier, prettier, and more deserving of good treatment and deference than other people who are dumber, dirtier, uglier, less interesting, and less deserving of our respect. And to buy into classism is to buy into that to some extent. And it sounds really awkward and awful when you say it out loud like that. Most people wouldn't. And yet, most Americans would, on some level, at least be able to recognize the imagery of someone with a very posh New York accent necessarily being better, more educated, more interesting, more deserving to lead a Fortune 500 company than someone named Billy Bob from Atlanta, because the assumption is that Billy Bob isn't like the very posh New York person,
Mm.
that they are worse in a number of different ways. And classism is a thing that comes in different forms, but exists in very familiar patterns across a number of different countries. And my upbringing, in many ways, gave me the opposite problem from the problem that you have. So I grew up in, it's very, I don't know, it's very, so I think I grew up in a reasonably normal middle class family. But I can see the look on your face. I can
Yeah,
see,
because I know things about your childhood. So please, I mean, when you say that, right, I want to hear how many swimming pools and
we had one
staff
swimming
you
pool
had.
in the back. We
Only
had
one swimming pool,
most two
just one,
people.
and
Yes,
just two staff to help you.
just
Right.
at most two,
Yeah.
sometimes only one.
Well, exactly.
We roughed it for years.
You roughed it for years. Look at me and my chickens.
I mean, we never had to pay them in chickens. It was so admittedly no. So I think for the environment I grew up in, I did have a very comfortable middle class existence, and the expectations for my life because of that existence were very good. They were very high. I mean, I never went skiing because I grew up in Jamaica, but I did go water skiing. That was fun. We went to a lot of hotels, a lot of foreign trips in my youth. I never worried about food. That's not something we worried about. We had other worries. And the interesting thing is that now, in my current life in the UK,
Mm.
you, I think, have the problem of people don't know who I am. They assume I'm middle class. I do not have this problem. I enter rooms and everyone thinks I grew up in the ghetto. I don't know why they think this, but it's the assumption. And I've had so many people say, it's amazing how far you've come having grown up in the ghetto. I'm like, what are you talking
Yeah.
about?
Didn't
Like,
you
what
have
makes you, oh,
I
it's because I'm
remember
black.
that. Didn't you have a journalist call you
I did, yeah.
specifically feedback?
A journalist, yes. They said, would you like to be on our television program? Sure, I'd love to. Great. We just need to hear from men who grew up in the ghetto and have managed to make their way into middle class spaces. I'm like, what the hell are you? What? Why do you think that? But it is because I'm black. And I don't think I dress like I grew up in the ghetto, although I don't know what that dress would look like. I have no idea. But the assumption I don't get middle class assumptions, and you do, which is
Yeah.
odd. Neither of us fits with the lifestyle that we grew up with in childhood.
Mm. And I find it interesting also how, again, it's expectations.
Yeah.
And expectations in terms of your class or, your social positioning, it comes with certain access, right? And I think that's a lot of the time what people dismiss. Because if you grew up in a certain level of privilege, you naturally assume that you have the access that you do, and you think that everybody has it, right?
Yeah.
Because again, like reflecting on my context, I would say in my community, I have witnessed, I think in my surroundings, about 30% of men who I knew, they died about the age of 50 from
Mm,
alcoholism. About 10% of guys, I would say, who are just kind of older than me, sort of like young people, I would say, they died of, I just was, watching them die from drug abuse.
mm,
And I think similar amount of women become prostitutes, right? So that's, and I think, again, in the context of my family growing up, I didn't think that. I thought I had it pretty good because, my dad wasn't an alcoholic. I was never actually physically abused.
Yeah.
So, and we had hot water. I wish so many people was jealous of that. You cannot imagine. Um,
I don't know how many chickens per month for hot water. I don't understand the conversion, but I'm glad that you had it.
but I think there is just that expectation that, well, you just need to work hard, Sasha, and then everything will come to you. But you do
Yeah.
have to consider the context and the fact that if you come with certain privileges, you will have access to certain places and you will have role models, right? You will pick
Yeah.
things up naturally from the community of people. I mean, I'm very good friends with, various middle class families, and I'm fascinated by 9-year-olds who have more confidence and better communication skills than I do because they're so comfortable walking into any kind of room and space and going like, oh, this is who I am. This is this is what I do, like oh rah, rah, rah. And I am fascinated by that and also deeply jealous.
Yes. And I think anyone who says, "Oh, we're all given the same opportunities," I honestly can't understand such a person. Like the level of willful ignorance and willful blindness you need to believe that is so ridiculous. It's everything to the private schools you can afford if your family is wealthier, to the designated rooms in your house so that you can do quiet work as a child as opposed to having to share rooms with other people, to the mountains of extra lessons that you go through, to the access to extracurricular activities
Yeah.
that I remember by the time I was 15 years old, I'd already started and decided to abandon piano lessons because I wasn't very good at them. I had exposure to other countries. I'd already traveled abroad to study for a summer at Yale, which was loads of fun, and I really did appreciate that. I had a black belt in martial arts. My older sister was driving her own car. Well, it was the family's car, but we had three cars, and so when we needed to go somewhere,
Only
well,
three.
you need more cars in Jamaica. But when we needed to go somewhere, we didn't have to figure out how we'd get there. We had a car that was just for the children to access that we could use, and our parents had their own individual cars. So we had access to so much stuff and resources and travel and experiences. We just took it for granted. That was the stuff that we had. And growing up now, my parents did fantastically well. I think there's been some generational changes. So I think people of this generation just have it harder. And I know the boomers will come at me for that, but it's just true. You can't buy a
Mhm.
house for £2,000 and sell it for 1 million. It's not possible anymore. It's just not, right? It's not. So that means my children have a bit more of a struggle, and I can see it. I can see that, oh, all these extra lessons cost money. All these tutors cost money. All this private stuff costs money. And the idea that children whose parents don't have that much money have the same opportunities as children whose parents do have that much money is ridiculous. And we should stop pretending that they do.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we can't disregard these external factors. And this is where I have the marshmallow study coming in mind.
Yes, the
It,
dreaded marshmallow study. Yeah.
exactly. It's a very famous and because it was about the gratification and delayed gratification, it leads to
Yeah.
better results as when you're an adult. That's not exactly
Yes.
the case, is it?
No, so the original marshmallow study, very simple. They get a bunch of children in and they say, here's a marshmallow on the table. If you eat the marshmallow now, you only get one marshmallow. But I'm going to go away. And if you can wait like 10 minutes or something, and the marshmallow is still there, I'll give you another marshmallow. So you'll get two marshmallows. And they found that some children just ate the marshmallows. I mean, stupid kids. They just ate the marshmallows, right? They must be dumb. That's why they did that. So they only got one. While some children who were super clever waited and then got two and then ate two. So they were smart. And the idea from the original marshmallow study was that the children who could delay their gratification, they did better in life because of this. And it was true that the children who waited and got the two marshmallows, they did better in terms of all sorts of life outcomes. I don't remember all of them. Do not quote me on this, but I'm sure it was jobs and earning and jail time and drug use and everything. They just did much better in life and they followed them later. But then later on, people redid the marshmallow study with more information. So they didn't just check whether they ate the marshmallows, they also checked how much money their families had. And once you took into account how much money they had, the predictive effects of the marshmallows disappeared. It wasn't that the dumb children were just being dumb and eating the marshmallows. It was that if you're rich, who cares about a marshmallow? Like you can just go get another marshmallow. You probably have marshmallows at home. You probably have better marshmallows than this at home. But if you don't have a lot of money, things are scarce and people promise you things and then don't give them to you. For all you know, this scientist person who you've never met in his life and is now promising you like marshmallows. This person, you don't know this person. Like they could be liars, right? And
Yeah.
if you don't eat this marshmallow now, you do not know what's going to happen in 5 minutes. So you better eat your marshmallow, which is very rational. And
Yeah.
so it was always the money. The money predicted how well they did. The marshmallows were just another side effect of having money.
Well, I mean, and I recognize that exactly in my life because
Yeah. Yeah.
if I was with my mother, like if I were with her and there were marshmallows, she would be like, "You eat those marshmallows. You eat those
Yeah.
marshmallows now because you will never know when you will have marshmallows ever again. So you
Yeah.
see it, you take it."
It's
Um,
rational. It's
it is,
rational.
it is because you never like, and again, in the context of my life. Like things were lumpy, like access to food was lumpy. You didn't have like a constant supply. It was more like, okay, we have food now, so you have to eat it now as much as you can. And then that because there might not be any later on. So there isn't and I still struggle to that to up to now really. And yeah, I know because you highlight that very often and
Yeah.
you keep me often.
Like sometimes when we're traveling and there we are, and oh, we're sitting sometimes as we travel around for fancy business reasons. Sometimes we're in the first class compartment of the train. Oh, are we taking yet another jet set afternoon trip to Paris? How fun. And then Sasha like cuts the croissant in half and like hides half of it in her bag. I'm like, Sasha, what are you doing? We don't have to do this. We can order more food. You are now the CEO of a very good company. You have more than enough money to just eat the croissant or don't eat the. You could throw one of them away. It would make almost no difference to your bottom line. But they just you cut it in half and you store it in a way that I have to admit I would never cross my mind. It would never ever cross my mind. I'd
Yeah.
always think there'll be more food.
And I appreciate that feedback, Keon. I think that a lot of it has highlighted, yeah, gave me something to reflect on with my therapist. Um, yeah, because that is exactly it. Because I genuinely have this anxiety about being hungry. I think I remember just being hungry and being yeah, um, yeah, and thinking, yeah, and I think that's the thing. Whereas I think if you have constant supply and that is actually my mantra in my head. I'm like, I don't need to worry about that. There will always be
Don't
food.
need to worry.
There
Yeah.
will be food when you're going to be hungry.
Yeah.
So that's the only time when you actually need to engage with food.
It is.
Um,
And I contrast you with my own children who languish around the table for eternity, and you really have to force them to eat. And their confidence that there will always be food, even when they've wasted an hour at the dinner table and they're rolling around on the floor. And now it's time for bed. And then the crying starts, and they know if they're hungry, they'll just get more food. There will never be a lack of food. This is not something that has ever crossed their minds.
yeah. And that's the thing, right? But so that's when we're talking about social mobility, how it's hard to bring these experiences, especially in the working context, right? A
Yeah.
lot of the time, like I can't necessarily bring up my experiences and talk about, my life because people find it traumatic and people find it like horrific listening to my stories. I did have to kill a pet rabbit once because
Oh,
and
wow.
eat it.
You hadn't told me that before. A pet rabbit.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of see, look at your face. Look at your face.
Sorry, I mean, no,
That
that's fine. That's
immediately makes
fine.
you
No, no,
uncomfortable.
nothing's wrong with my face. My face is fine. Those of you who are only listening, my face has remained a
Your
perfect
face is exactly the
cheerfulness.
reason
No,
why I can't bring up stories like that in a normal meeting because people get horrified and they don't know how to respond. It becomes very uncomfortable for
like
everyone
that's
and it
to me,
shuts down the
like that's a lot
conversation.
harder than the chicken thing, which is just kind of a funny, oh, I wonder what they're going like. What's the chicken to euro exchange rate? I once murdered a rabbit out of hunger. I'm like, oh, wow. Well, shall we continue talking about the appropriate language in DEI context? It's a
But
very different, it's a very different conversation.
yeah.
Um,
And that's, I think people like me That's why they struggle bringing just opening up about like the class and experience. Because yes, not everybody had my level of maybe destitution, but again, in the UK, I know a lot of people who at some point, for example, had to go to the food bank because again, their
Yes.
parents lost their jobs
Yeah.
or something like there was just not much of a supply of things, and then immediately drops into shame. I mean, I know people, middle class people, whose children would go to boarding schools. But again, because they were in just because they were in a certain class system, it doesn't mean they actually had good cash flow.
Yes.
And they had similar struggles in the sense that they could not necessarily buy uh things that their children needed, including like, good food and good clothes. And it was more, but they were very protective of that perception.
I think that also brings up something else about classism, which makes it different from other isms, at least some of the time, which is that most of us wouldn't ascribe to the overt, horrifically offensive version of classism that I said earlier. Middle and upper class people are pretty and nice and good and educated, and working class people are dumb and ugly and we don't like them. But people do ascribe to it explicitly to some extent. So we don't overtly say, oh, black people are bad. I mean, some people do, but those people are horrible. And we don't overtly say, oh, women should be, like chattel slave class. We don't say that most of the time. Most people don't. But a surprising number of people are explicit and overt and very comfortable expressing classism. That I remember in my childhood growing up, we didn't hide this. Like, we made fun of people's accents. We made fun of where people lived. If someone's parents had to go to the food bank, and I'm not saying these are values I inherited from my family, I don't think that's true. But I do think generally in society, I remember as a teenager, we would make fun of people just for being poor. That would be a thing that people do.
Hmm.
And if children today are anything like children when I was a child, I understand it's been some time, I think they continue to do that. And from what I hear, children make fun of you because of the clothes you wear or the shoes you can or can't afford or the bag
Yeah.
you do or don't have. And what we understand accurately that if you tell people I use a food bank, some people will treat you worse and they will treat you worse for that reason, and they won't even be ashamed of the fact that they're treating you worse for that reason. There is an overtness to classism that makes it harder to deal with because many people think it's fine, that it's just okay to do.
Yeah. So let's talk about solutions,
Yes.
especially in the working context. What solutions or, yeah, how should we approach social mobility? I think the first thing that is a big challenge is actually measuring it and defining what social mobility is. And I think we
Yes.
should circle back to our time with the European Consortium,
Yes.
where we worked with a group of incredible academics on this topic and tried to define what social mobility is and how it can be captured in different countries.
Yes. And I think that it was a really great group from a number of different countries. So, we had Germany, Sweden, the UK. I can't remember
Spain,
everywhere.
Poland,
Poland, like
Italy.
a lot. A
Mm.
lot. Yes, Spain, of course. Lots of people. Really good, highly intelligent, like well done professors across the board. So we really got to hash these things out. The tricky thing with measuring social mobility is that it's a very funny concept, as I said, that most people think you can see race, you can see gender. Can you see class? No, it's one of those things you have to pull apart from other things. A very widely used measure that we still use on some of our stuff is measuring certain attainment of the child versus the parents. So what I mean by that is if you have moved up from, let's say, the education level of your parents to yourself, then you'd be considered to be climbing in social class. Whereas if you go the other way, then not so much. Or if you stay the same, again, not so much. So from my own life, both my parents are, pretty high level medical doctors with, consultancies behind them. So I have a doctorate, but I don't think that's considered moving up. So I think from my parents to my sisters to myself, the educational attainment is incredibly steady. It's pretty high to start and it stayed pretty high. No changes were expected there. Where some people could say, well, my parents, they started off without any education beyond high school, and now I have a
Yeah,
master or I have a doctorate, and
yeah.
they'd be considered to be climbing in that sense.
And I think, well, what we also recommend to clients that if they don't know where to start, actually just to refer to the Social Mobility Commission. They have
Yeah.
done quite a lot of work on this. They have also, I mean, they are the ones in the UK who probably have the best data on this, the best benchmarking data, and they effectively encourage you to ask 4 questions if you want to measure social mobility. Those questions only really are applicable to UK. If you take them
Mm.
beyond, they're not really that relevant because again, it kind of reflects the UK context.
Yes. And
But
the UK
you
context is
can
like,
I think you can adapt those to for more for Europe. And I think generally our suggestion would be don't look for perfect questions, just settle with good enough questions because again, it's a very broad concept.
yes. And one thing that you also brought up after our very interesting work with the European Consortium was that there is some utility that remains in just asking people what class they feel like, because this is a conversation I've had as well, and I have to tread a bit carefully. So this is one of my privileged spaces. So now I know what all those white people feel like when they talk to me and they're like, "Whoa, I'm going to say something about black people, but I'm going to warn you just in case. I hope it's not too racist." And like half of the time it is, half the time it isn't. But I talk to working class friends, and I've had conversations. In fact, I think I might have even had a version of this conversation with you. And I was like, oh, I've been reading all this wonderful political theory, and I've come to the realization that there is no middle, upper, and working class. There's just the capitalists and the proletariat, and we're all proletariat. And my working class friends would say, no, no, that is not true. You only think that because you're a middle class person. If you're genuinely a working class person and you understand the struggles associated, you would never say that. And so I do think some level of self-identification remains important, right? Like you know if you grew up working class or not, and we can trust you on that. We don't necessarily need to get around you to figure that out.
Yeah. And a lot of it, and also actually the mindset and the approach, that's
Yeah.
what a lot defines it because, I've had conversations with millionaires who would say, well, I'm working class because I work. Um,
Yeah, that's
and and I'm like,
I work and
I
I'm
think,
classy.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
working class.
I'm working class, exactly. So, and I mean, I generally love the phrase. It's like for me, one of the definitive phrases around that. Well, I work very hard, and there's a difference between, well, you earn millions and you work very hard by going to fancy meetings and sitting in front of a laptop. To, let's say, I would say my granddad worked very hard because he worked, he worked in a factory, and
Yeah,
his days off were working in the fields,
yeah,
growing food. So there wasn't you constantly work, like constantly, and it's labor. It's things that you create that you can't invest into yourself or the future. It's uh it's sustain. It's just to sustain your existence. For
yeah,
me, that's the key difference, and maybe the separation between classes.
yeah. I also think there's a difference in, again, how people respond. So, so some of my other, let's say, black male friends, one of them has spoken to me and he said he wished he could call a school and sound the way I sound when I call a school. Because when he calls a school, he gets the impression people generally, about his son, they kind of ignore him a bit. But if he called with my accent and my vocabulary, they'd suddenly have to respond quite differently. And I
Mhm.
have experienced that, in which I do get that I'm treated badly in many places, and then I open my mouth and people suddenly react, "Oh, sorry, we mistook you for one of the grubby ghetto people." I'm like, I don't know why you would do
Yeah.
that, why you are so rude. But I do think that there is that sense of not only the labor being different, because I think even if, doctors had to work all the time and they couldn't invest in anything, I think at the end of the day, you walk into a store as a doctor, it's different from walking in as a laborer who's treated in a very rude way. And that's something that
Yeah.
we can't ignore.
I think for me, one of the crucial things is that class is associated with dignity.
Yes,
And
dignity and respect. Yeah.
depending on what class you're from, there is like a correlation of the level of dignity that you deserve. And I
Yes.
think And that is one of the key challenges. And I have to say and that is a chicken and egg situation. This is where we kind of go into that Pygmalion Rosenthal effect. I think like the way we treat people and what we expect from people is actually what we get. I think I personally have experienced it quite a lot living in Dudley, and because I was volunteering with the police, and we did a lot of just work with the young children on quite rough estates. And I was
Yeah.
fascinated because these kids had no aspiration or like no even perception that there could be aspiration. And a lot of the time because they have never been treated with dignity or respect. And you see that a lot, especially with, in communities. Again, like, and if in the communities more like, tower blocks and immigrants and refugees, that they're just not treated with dignity.
Yeah. And it's hard because related to that, immigrants, refugees, not treated with dignity. I have sometimes given presentations and people have said to me, oh, in the UK, we don't have a race problem. We have a class problem. It just so happens that, all those darkies are working class and therefore we treat them badly. And I get so angry on two fronts.
Mm,
One, total nonsense, total nonsense. In the UK, we totally have a class problem. That is detectable by, again, getting people to do exactly the same things, but in a working class accent or a middle class accent, and they treat the working class people worse. We have a class problem, no question. But we also have a race problem. We have a race problem that's
yeah.
independent of class. You get middle class people of, different colors, and they will treat the people of different colors worse than the people who are white because they are not white. It's not because of their class. There's a race problem and a class problem, and then they add together. So if you are a working class person of color, you get both. You get hit with both. To me, it's as ridiculous as saying, we don't have a race problem, we have a gender problem. It just so happens that all the black people are women. I'm like, that's obviously nonsense. Obviously, that isn't true. And we have both problems. So let's see if we can address both problems because I think that's important.
Yeah. So to summarize, I would say that if you like the way to approach social mobility is on the individual level, first of all, just treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of where they come from or whatever assumptions you would make about their job, ethnicity, background, etc. I would also say stay away from assumptions, and instead of asking them where do they ski, maybe ask them if they do ski, and if you want to actually know if they do ski, why do you need to know if they ski? Like, do they do sports? Like, what is it that they enjoy? What is there an activity that makes them excited? Because then that just it just is a bit more of a subtle way of connecting with someone without putting them in the position where they immediately feel anxious, like, am I going to be in, or am I going to be out, depending on the answer that I give. And then third, if you're looking at how to measure social mobility, which I think is a good thing to do, think about how to do it, refer to some benchmarks like the Social Mobility Commission, and think how to adapt it for your workplace.
Yeah. And I would add to that, which I do agree with all of it. I'd say treat it like any other demographic variable, that if you really care about it, you have to be measuring it. If you're not measuring it, you can't claim to care about it. And once you measure it, you then have to start seeing what it correlates with. So does it correlate with good outcomes in your workplace or with bad outcomes in your workplace? Are they paid less than other people? Are they less happy? Do they feel less of a sense of belonging? Is their feedback as good? All these things can be measured. And if you're measuring it, then you can make goals, you can make strides towards fixing it. But if you're taking it seriously and you say, well, we want to do it, you have to have those measurements in place and you have to set up structures like you would for any other demographic category to make sure that they're being treated well. What you don't get to do is use them as a prop and say, we might not have any women or ethnic minorities, but we've got so much class diversity. How have you measured that? I don't know. Like, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. That's not allowed. That's bad uses of working class people.
Don't use working class people badly.
Don't use them badly. Use them well. Use them well.
Yeah. Well, there you go. We're going to stop here with that wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We would love to hear from you. So do get in touch on social media channels or email us directly.
Yes, get in touch. We'd love to hear what you think, and we'd love you to suggest topics that you'd find interesting. See you next week.